Welcome to NBF Presents, Borders of Belonging. I'm Natalie Green, the National Book Foundation's Public Programs Manager. We're thrilled and grateful to share the screen with three bright writers this evening. Thanks to you for tuning in and to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for supporting NBF Presents. You likely best know the National Book Foundation as the presenter of the National Book Awards, which honor the best literature in America. The awards fuel our year-round work to reach readers of all ages all over the country. So far, we've visited libraries, colleges, book festivals, and performance centers in 40 states. The pause on in-person programming meant a pause on plans to visit our friends at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces last fall. So we're thrilled to give them a special shout out tonight. Thanks to Russ Bradford and NBA family Brandon Hobson, we were able to get copies of tonight's featured authors' books into students' hands. A special hello to all those from New Mexico State joining us tonight. Book distributions to students, public housing authorities, prisons, and detention centers across the U.S., alongside our free year-round education and public programming, wouldn't be possible without your help. If you're able to, please consider donating at nationalbook.org/donate. And now for tonight's program. Laila Lalami and Karla Cornejo Villavicencio chat with Concepción de León on borders, belonging, and their stunning books. We'll share the link to buy said books with gratitude to our season's bookseller partner, Loyalty Bookstores. Real-time live captioning is available and linked to in the chat, thanks to our captioner, Caitlin Morey. At the end, we'll open up to a few questions from the audience. You can submit those at any time directly into the live chat. And now, a little more about our guests. Laila Lalami was born in Rabat and educated in Morocco, Great Britain, and the United States. She is the author of 4 novels, including The Moor's Account, which won the American Book Award, the Arab American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. Her most recent novel, The Other Americans, was a national bestseller and a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. Her new book, a work of nonfiction called Conditional Citizens, was published in September 2020. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the LA Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and the New York Times. She has received fellowships from the British Council, Fulbright, and the Guggenheim Foundation, and is currently a professor of creative writing at the University of California at Riverside. She lives in Los Angeles. With the publication of her debut book, The Undocumented Americans, Karla Cornejo Villavicencio became the first undocumented finalist for a National Book Award. Her book was also named by Barack Obama as one of his favorite books of 2020 and was selected as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, Time, NPR, the LA Times, the New York Public Library, and so many more. The Undocumented Americans is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Best First Book. Karla has written about immigration, music, beauty, and mental illness for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Vogue, among others. She lives in New Haven with her partner and their dog. She is a graduate of Harvard University and a doctoral candidate in American Studies at Yale. And our moderator, Concepción de León, is a reporter covering breaking news for the New York Times. Prior to that, she spent 3 years writing about literary news and culture for the books department and is a Glamour magazine alum. And now I'll give it away. Enjoy the program.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to chat with both Karla and Layla. And I wanted to start with just for the people that haven't read the book, just a brief kind of synopsis of what your books are about. And then I thought we could go from there.
My book is a collection of essays where I interview people across some cities in the United States who are undocumented. They tend to be older people who are sometimes the parents of dreamers, but they tend to be older and they're not on DACA or are dreamers. And I also tell my story and my family story.
Yeah.
So my novel is called The Other Americans, and it's about a family that comes together again following the suspicious death of the father in a hit and run accident. And the book is told from 9 different perspectives of people who are affected by this death, including members of the family.
Yeah.
And it's set in a small town in the California desert.
Yeah. I wonder if you guys could talk about, you both have the word Americans in your name, in the title of your books. And I wonder if you guys could both talk about that choice and perhaps how you relate to that label and related to that label since you moved to the US.
I didn't know. Should I go first, or
Yeah, sure. You could go first. Sorry.
I'm trying to think. I think that the book it took me about 4.5 years to write it. And so in the process of writing it, it has changed titles. And I settled on the title of The Other Americans at around the same time that I settled on the sort of like the architecture of the book, because it's told from 9 different perspectives, some of which are connected. So it's, for example, the mother, the daughter, the sister, a witness, a family friend. And all of these people are basically taking turns narrating sort of their own lives and how they're connected to this death. And one of the things that arose out of that choice of architecture was I began to see how my initial interest, which had been to explore a story of family alienation. So in other words, you can belong to a family, but still feel completely alienated from the people that you love the most, how that actually ended up extending to other people in the story who were who were narrating the story in the sense that they too had it sort of emerged out of that narration that some of those characters as well felt that sense of alienation, but with respect to other groups. So, for example, the daughter feels she's a musician and so she's a composer, and it's a field very much dominated by men. So there's like all this sort of like difficulty in being part of that group. Several of the characters are immigrants, including the parents. So there's questions about belonging to a nation and community. One of the detectives relocated from a large town, from Washington, D.C. to a small town. And so there's like this sort of internal migration. And as I started working on the book and redrafting it, and I started noticing how each of the characters really experience a sense of dislocation with respect to either family or community or nation, thought that it really came down to a question of belonging and therefore to a sense of feeling othered. And so that's when the idea of calling the book The Other Americans came about.
Yeah. Karla, what about for you?
We have very similar book titles. My book title comes from a compromise with my book editor. They were going to call it something else, and I got this book title as a compromise. It's supposed to be a reference to Henry James, which no one got, as a reference, I guess, is only satisfying when you're recognized as a genius, and no one recognized me as a genius. People seem to want me
they will.
People seem to want me to talk about whether or not I feel American. It's like, well, I'm South American. It's like a fact that I am American. It's like if all goes well in a few years, I will become a citizen. I find the question boring, not your question, but like the question people want to engage me with, which is like, when I have felt American, what makes me feel American? I find some things that are, my road to assimilation, when I have talked to immigrants that I have interviewed about, moments that have teetered them closer to or further away from feeling American, they kind of sound annoyed at me by the question. They're like, what does that mean? Why are you asking me this? There's always like a pause, and they're like, no, and I would say, like I write in the book, similar to what I've observed from my parents, which is like, I think my family identifies very strongly with New York. I identify very strongly with Queens. I've lived in New Haven, Connecticut for the past 10 years, and I like it. I think that I like the Northeast. I like New England, but I was formed by New York, and specifically by Queens, and the pan-Latinness of the neighborhood I grew up in. I am eternally charmed by the fact that I don't know what casseroles are. I've tried to figure it out. It's just like this ephemeral, I am. America as a concept evades me. Yeah. So they were going to title my book Undocumented America. Can you imagine? That sounds like a wildlife show. And I said no.
Yeah. No, I asked because, I think Karla and you and I have talked about this, but I grew up undocumented, and I feel like there was this kind of process. Or I guess to me, it was like, no, of course I'm not American, because I'm not American, because my papers didn't say so. And so it just seemed so straightforward to me. But I find that everyone kind of has a different process through that. You called it the sort of road to assimilation. And I wonder, like, just what that road looked like for both of you. And then maybe you could start, Karla, and not actually assimilating, because obviously assimilation as a concept is kind of problematic, but just like, was it something that you thought about? And like, if it wasn't, like, that's miraculous. And I'm so, I'm so jealous of you. But I wonder if it was like something that you thought about and that you were questioning as you were growing up, and how you kind of came to an answer to that. And then I thought we could start with you, Karla, and then maybe Layla, you can jump in.
Yeah, I thought about how, I thought about how much had to do with luck. I realized very quickly how quickly I learned English, and how quickly I lost my accent. And I do have a certain way of enunciating that I know is because I learned English as a second language, and also because I learned English from like a dictionary and from television. And I do have a different way of enunciating in Spanish because I learned Spanish from my parents, and also from like soap operas. And, I knew that some people who learned English never lost their accents, and they would never be able to, like on the phone, be able to pass. And that was never lost on me. I knew that I would never be made fun of for my accent. And so I was always aware of the ways where luck was on my side, and I felt guilty for it for a long time. And then at some point I replaced the word luck with Russian roulette, because you just don't know. You just don't know. And I think a lot of people think it's hard work, or they think it's practice, or they think it's something to do with your ethics or values or person, your personhood. And it's not. I think that different immigrants have a different relationship with assimilation. I think obviously as a Latina who grew up in a community that was very diverse, I strongly identified with other people of color. I strongly identified with other Latinx people and with African Americans in the city. And so I felt like that was my community. And I did not want to, I never at any point become white. And in Spanish, like whiteness and Americanness is often the same thing. And for me, it was always a matter of loyalty. There was always a belief in like sort of like street ethics and street code to be to sort of know where you came from. And that was both to remember, even if you achieved legal status, that you had been undocumented and that your community was, your alignment was with people who had been undocumented, with people who had been incarcerated, with people who, made their money in an informal economy. And so I know that I look like someone who has assimilated and who has achieved success in a way that this country and capitalism and all that finds acceptable. But I don't think of myself that way.
Yeah. Layla, what about for you? I know that you were older when you came to the US than Karla was.
Yeah, I think what really resonates for me listening to Karla speak is this idea of chance. I think that it is in some ways in the United States, there's such an emphasis on choice and personal responsibility as kind of like an American ethos that people really have a hard time, or many Americans have a hard time accepting that chance can play such a great role in a person's life and that it can have grave consequences, massive consequences, really, in how our lives are shaped. And I have had plenty of time to really reflect on that when I look at the course that my life has taken. I'm much older than Karla. And one of the things that I have come to realize is that everything about citizenship, absolutely everything about it, has to do with chance. You don't choose where you're born. And the citizenship that you are essentially given at birth ends up deciding a number of things for you. If you are born in, say, for example, North Korea, you don't have freedom of movement. If you are born in, Saudi Arabia, you don't have freedom of religion. If you're born, and so it's very random, and the kinds of rights and liberties that you enjoy are entirely a question of luck and have nothing to do with choice. And yet there's like this country, there's like this sort of like ethos of pride in Americanness and pride in nationality. And that has always seemed to me very foreign. So I was born and raised in Morocco, and I'll just point out a couple of places where chance has played a role. I grew up in a working class family, and it just so happened that the nearest school to my aunt's apartment was a French school, so they put me there. And so I ended up going to a French school when I was little. Years later, when I was in high school, I took English as a foreign language. So my first class in English was I started learning English at the age of 15 as a third language. And I enjoyed it. And so when I finished high school, I was actually supposed to go to medical school, but I gave up on that idea and decided to major in English. And because I enjoyed that those English courses in high school, so it was completely by chance. If I had like actually taken German classes instead as a foreign language, who knows? I wouldn't be sitting here today. So, so one after the other, these sort of like chance things happens. And once I decided to come to the United States to go to graduate school, and my idea was to finish my coursework, return to Morocco, write my dissertation there, and just stay there. I was trying to figure out how I could do this in as little time as possible, thinking that my stay in the US wouldn't be long. And instead, what ended up happening is I met someone and we got married. And before I knew it, I was living in LA and eventually becoming a citizen. So I really recognize how much chance has played the role in my life, and really because of that, it has had a great effect and on my sort of creative and my critical thinking. I've really been interested in how sort of like the landscape that we live in, like the where we live, how that ends up affecting our identity and identity formation. So, for example, in the novel before this one, in the Moore's account, the main character is somebody who is brought. It's based on a true story. Is brought from Morocco as an enslaved man and comes to what is now the U.S. Back then was just the native land that the Spaniards were trying to take over. And during the course of the book, like, his identity basically is affected by his environment. I do think that chance does play this big role in our lives, and it does affect our identity. Identity is not something that is like fixed, and nor is our belonging. It is something that constantly shifts over the course of our lives, and chance plays a part in that. It plays a part in deciding these circumstances.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I'm really interested in, both of you include characters whose first language isn't English. And Karla, in your case, you had to translate quotes to English, and Layla, you had a character who you wrote about in the first person who never quite mastered English. And I wonder how you guys approached that. And how you sort of thought about how to best represent their voices and to remain true to what they were trying to say. And you both also speak other languages, and so I wonder how that factors into your writing process as well.
I speak one other language.
Yeah, it's more than many people.
I don't know. What did I do?
Well, I know in your book, for instance, in your intro, you kind of talk about how you didn't approach it as straight translation, and you sort of took a different approach. So if you want to maybe start with talking about that.
My psychiatrist said something interesting the other day, which I think I'm curious how much of it applies to other areas of my life. He took something that I thought I did as a choice, and then he sort of explained how I did it because that's how my brain works, and I did it to protect myself. Yeah. Now I wonder if that's just how my brain works, and I did it to protect myself. But that's a side note. So what I said was that I don't like the way that translations are often handled, where it's like sort of like a straight word for word translation, and where people end up sounding dumb, and you don't get any of like the thickness and like the subtleties and the subtext when you're having like a conversation with a person. And that I don't mean for this to sound saccharine at all, because I think some people are dicks. But like, I feel like translation, I wanted to approach it more like translating poetry. So you're kind of like rewriting the poem, but like you have to be saying what they're saying, but you do have to, dance with the words a little bit. And so that's how I approached the translation. And I also wanted it to have the spirit of what I was doing, which is like being a kid who was translating for, older immigrants, and which is what I had done since I was a child, and what the readers of my book, the intended audience of my book, which were children of immigrants, had probably done all their lives. So in the spirit of that, that's what I did. I was like, I'm going to translate this book like Edith Grossman translated things, not the way that like academics or journalists would translate things. And so now I'm wondering if that was a representational decision that I made because like my brain works that way. But we'll see.
Yeah.
So in the case of my character, the character I think that you're referring to has been in the U.S. for 35 years, but came here as an adult and was not necessarily fluent in English when she came. So while her fluency has improved over the course of 35 years, she's still in a way that really shows that she's not a native speaker. And in writing that voice, I relied on a number of things. I relied first on personal experience. I remember when I came to the US and I would, I just mispronouncing certain things or misunderstanding certain things, and people would just laugh and they would think it was just so amusing. So I still remember those days very well, and I remember examples from that. And I think because of my training in linguistics, one of the things that I did when I approached that voice was not only rely on my personal experience, but basically break it down in terms of components. So I would, for example, with that particular character, rest a lot on syntax and on run-on sentences, basically making sure that when she spoke, like the sentences are they just kind of keep going for like paragraphs. And because that's how a lot of, that's what I remember, from the experience. And that's how a number of the people that I know that still speaks that way, that's what they do. And then going back over in redrafting and in the next draft, then I would focus on, for example, particular lexical items, like the semantics of it. And then in another, draft, I would try and figure out if there was something I could add that was more phonetic. So it was this strange thing where it was a combination of personal experience and memory, but also using some of the more technical things that I could think of to render it in a sort of realistic way for that voice.
Yeah. I wanted to remind everyone first that if you have any questions, you should feel free to put them in the chat. And in around maybe 15, 20 minutes, we'll get to questions. And that way we can all get them answered. So you mentioned earlier, Layla, you talked about family alienation and wanting to capture that in your book. And I think I'm really interested in that topic because I feel like often when we talk about family separation, we're talking about the people at the border who are separated. But there's so many kind of levels to it where there are people who live in this country and perhaps are undocumented and haven't seen the, members of their immediate family for years or decades. And so I wonder if you guys can kind of talk a little bit about what are the family dynamics that you hope to capture in the book, or how you tried to tackle that, and what impact that those sort of migration has on families, essentially. Maybe you can start, Layla.
Yeah, sure. When I moved to the United States, it was in the early 90s. And in between then and now, I have parents at intervals of sometimes several years, and haven't seen other members of my family for many years. And it just became, while it was extremely difficult in the first years, it became this thing that you sort of get used to, that you see your parents at, every 2 years or every 3 years, or they come and visit every couple of years. So but there was never this sort of access where I could just pop in on my mother or, ask her a question. It was just always this sort of time with her was very precious. And it was never easy, but it became even more difficult once I became a mother myself, and having a child that does not have access to grandparents. Can you imagine how many school functions, how many, birthdays, how many celebrations, how many, so all of that is something that your child is also deprived of, not just you. And so it was I've spent the last couple of decades of my life really contending with this loss. It's something that's with me all the time. Yeah. And I think what's happened in the pandemic is people got a little bit of some people who are fortunate to live with their families have had a bit of training with that, like to kind of figure out what it's like to have what the reality is for many immigrants. But the kind of alienation that I write about in my book is not simply like the sort of physical alienation, which is something that I've experienced, but also I would say alienation that comes from experiences that are a little bit more, how should I describe them? That are more cultural. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I mean. So when I was growing up, I remember I mentioned earlier, my parents had put me in a French school. So I grew up speaking a language that my grandmother, for example, my grandmother was illiterate, did not speak or understand. And that sort of like schooling, which many people told me was that I was lucky to have, what it really did is just create this alienation from my grandmother, because while I could communicate with her, of course, and spend time with her, at the same time, we really like the frame of references that we had in our lives were completely different. And so I learned to do a lot of code switching when I was little. And the same thing that happened between her and her son, my dad, was that she was illiterate, but he went to school. And so, that also created another gulf. So within 3 generations of one family, you could see how forces like education or that are positive, but also other forces like colonial influences can create a sense of cultural alienation within a family. And so in the book, I explore both the sort of physical alienation that can exist in families, through immigration, because this is an immigrant family, but also the alienation that can come from growing up in a culture where one member might be native to that culture, where that everything about that culture sort of makes sense on a certain level, but then at home, it doesn't necessarily make sense in the same way. And children have to navigate all of that. They have to learn to code switch. They have to constantly be speaking in 2 languages, even if those 2 languages are really the same language. So it is, that's what I was, I think, trying to get at in the novel.
Yeah, I really related to that, because when I went to college and then came back, I remember I was just mad at everyone. I was just like, nobody understands me. I sort of just felt like I had gotten all these different influences and become a totally different person, and no one got that. Karla, what about for you?
I think probably my greatest contribution to literature thus far is having a debut book that was not dedicated to my parents or to my partner. And that is great. And I hope people notice. It originally was dedicated to my parents. And I sent one very lucky reader a copy of the page ripped out that said, "To my parents," from one of the galleys. Because he wrote me a note being like, talking about how much he owed his parents and about the great debt that he had for them. And I was like, yeah, we do, but also you have to be your own person. And, and so I decided at some point that it was going to be very liberating for me to not dedicate the first book to my parents, in order for it to be mine. And there's stories that I tell that I didn't set out to tell that are just a variety of people's dynamics with their families in the book, and they run the gamut. What I ultimately saw is that through all of the various rewritings of the book, throughout the drafts, that I set out with what I think is a very common thing in the Latinx community, which is a view of migrant men as kind of martyrs, because they work outside of the home and suffer a lot of abuse. And then they get home and then they come home. And because we view them as martyrs, we allow them sometimes to become many tyrants. And they're just Christ-like figures. So we excuse a lot. And I do mean daughters. And I also mean sons in different ways. And so I had to figure out how to depict my father and how to depict men who I had to not write that way. And who I knew I was only seeing one side of. And I needed to not glorify or to villainize, but to just show that I was writing a character portrait of them. And it was that I was just one person and that they were just one person. And it was not the definitive story of immigrants. And it was not the definitive story of undocumented people, or even of those people, or even of my father. It was just like a glance at a person's life one day. And so I think that complexity and that ability to be just a person is not granted to immigrants very often.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I wonder, like, something that I struggled with when I, a few years into when I started writing was just what audience I was writing for. So I feel like because I was formed within mainstream institutions, I found after a few years that I was kind of learning how to write for white people. And Karla, you and I think have spoke about this in the past, but I wonder, like, what were your influences when it came to writing, and what, essentially, like, how did you guys find your voices? Layla, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I smile because one time somebody asked me, when did you know that you had a voice? And I said, I've always had a voice. And they looked at me like I was like, I don't know, like I had a third ear or something. Like I was, how bold of me to say that I always had a voice. But each of us has a voice. And it's just, the question is that those voices are not necessarily heard. And that's a completely different question. In terms of who I'm writing for, I really try. I heard what you're saying about, like, feeling this pressure to write for a particular kind of audience. I really, really try to write for myself. Try to write for readers such as myself, if not for myself. And that's hard because the frames of reference that I bring to my writing is at once African and Arab, and yet also that of an immigrant in the U.S. And so there's like all these kind of very, very different reference points, very different influences in terms of literature, literary influences. And I think when you put out work, there's always people are reacting to it based on their own, reading. And, the mainstream is going to react a particular way to the writing. And so there can be a particular kind of pressure that comes from that. So I try my best to write for myself or for readers such as myself, which is to say, that of, an immigrant from North Africa here in the US. It's like all of these different references at once.
Right. What about for you, Karla?
Man, I wanted to be a rock star when I was a kid, and I was not given music lessons. This is what happens.
It's criminal.
What happened? So I started writing about music when I was a teenager, and then I just milked it for all it was worth. And then I realized I couldn't be a journalist because I was profoundly unethical. Also, I was undocumented. I was like writing about bands where I had like a crush on people in the band. And I was, this is not for women journalists, And then I was like, oh, I'm undocumented. I'll write about that since people aren't doing a good job. They're I don't know. I've talked about this. I didn't like it, and then I kind of kept the voice, and it's I didn't get music lessons as a kid. This is what happens.
I think we're all grateful.
I sent my editor like a video of the Arctic Monkeys playing Glastonbury, and I was like, "This is what I want." And he's like, "You write essays, right? But what can Random House do for me?" And this is just what they get, and I just sometimes like think back and be like, what could have been my life? And this is what I have. I'm doing an event for the National Book Foundation when I could be at the Grammys. Right.
Yeah. But you know what's funny about that is I've met musicians and they have this bizarre awe for writers. And I'm just like in awe of the musicians. It's kind of interesting because like you always, I guess, I mean, at least I look at what they do as if it were, I don't know, magic, because it seems so exotic, like this idea that they can play instruments. And I'm always amazed by the work of other artists. And it really seems to me so mysterious and magical. Whereas what I do, which is writing, seems to me, right. But I guess that's the difference between being inside and outside.
Yeah, I think they're both different types of storytelling. We're going to move over to questions from the audience in a second, but I did have one last question for you guys, which is, Layla, you said, I've always known I had a voice, and Karla, from conversations with you both now and in the past, I see and have heard that you also have always felt that way and never really felt this conflict that I felt, which is like, how do I learn how to write in my own voice? Like I felt like I had to kind of learn that for myself because of the formation I got. And so I wonder what advice you have for other people who maybe didn't always had that sort of confirmation or sense of validity in what they had to say. Layla, you can.
I would say that one of the hardest things, and this is something that I've had to learn over the years, is to sort of parent yourself in a way that you wish that you had been parented. Now, while I have been fortunate to grow up around parents who read and encouraged reading, other parts without getting into them, maybe not, I've needed to work on those other things. And so when it comes to books and reading, you sort of have to learn to nurture that reading for yourself and to tell yourself that you have a voice and to be kind to that voice and help it grow. And the best way to do that is to constantly read and to learn to withhold judgment. So when you write, let's not immediately, pass judgment on what was written, just like write and move on and write the next thing and move on and write the next thing. And by practicing that, it's a way of basically nurturing the writing in a way that you wish it had been nurtured by, parents or educators or other people in your life. That would be the advice I would have.
What about you, Karla?
I would say, if without naming names, like if you are overrepresented in this field and you don't have a voice, some people don't have voices, and it's not a confidence thing. Like if women of color, immigrants, we are not overrepresented in this field, and we don't have the industry is not oozing with our stories, with representations of characters that are complex and nuanced, right? If you are overrepresented in the arts, you don't have a voice and you don't have something to say, maybe don't become a writer. Don't.
Great advice.
There are a lot of books. There are too many books. I'm sorry. The National Book Foundation should cover its ears. There's too many writers that don't have anything to say and don't have an interesting voice. Like, don't. Just don't. It just depresses me. And then I text my editor about it. And then it just, he has to put me on airplane mode.
You and your editors seem to have a great rapport.
It's one-sided. A lot. And
that's hilarious. Yeah. I'm going to read out some questions from some people that are watching. Some of them are for one of you, some of them are for both of you. So the first one was from Lori, and it says, it was a question to Karla. What was the original title of the book before you had to compromise? I think you answered this earlier. Was it the Undocumented America?
It was just Undocumented America. It's worse. Undocumented America.
So yes, that's the answer to that. And then Kane, oh my God, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I'm sorry if I'm not. But ask both, at any point of writing, did you find yourself struggling to contribute to the book? How did you push past that? So I guess, how did you push past writer's block if you felt it? And Layla, maybe you could start. Karla, she had no writer's block.
Writer's block. I think that I've had this with other books too. Like, you can start and be full of enthusiasm, and then you're going to hit a point where, I don't know, it could be 50 pages in, or 100 or 150 pages, and then it's hard to keep going. And I honestly don't know that there is any other way out but through. You just have to, you just have to do it. You just have to continue through. I think if the idea that you are working on is seductive enough, and I think if the characters are interesting enough, you're gonna want to continue. And the way that I've had to talk myself into maintaining sort of the stamina for long-term projects is to disconnect myself from the results, meaning that my task every day is to put in the time at my desk and to write, whether that results in, 1,000 words or 100 words. That's the part that I try to disconnect from, whether that results in a finished book that's going to get published, or if it sits in a drawer with the other stuff, disconnect from that. And that, by trying, I'm not saying that it's easy or that I'm always successful at it, but by trying that approach, it has, it really just allows me to actually be free. And freedom is so important in writing. And so it just keeps me, that's what keeps me going with longer term projects.
Yeah.
That's good advice for me because, I think, I had a lot of mystique around like how to write and how to get myself to write. And then ultimately when it's like, comes to deadline time and you have a contract, I think that's what gets me to finish a project. So then it's like, I'm like, was I able to do this all along? But before I'm like, well, I do have this ritual, right? And then when it's like, well, my deadline was last month, and now my agent's like, we don't want to get sued. And then I'm like, oh, I'm magically able to write like 10 pages. So that's good advice.
It's funny how that works.
I write something every day.
That's great. So Carmen asked, what are your thoughts on people believing that reading books such as yours, and this is for both of you, can make readers more empathetic?
I mean, I don't know. Like, if it does make you more empathetic, don't DM me about it. Like because people do, and I'm like, I hope not. Like, I hope not. I do believe the humanities makes people better people. I do believe that. If you're on a journey to betterment and my book is a part of that, I rather not know.
Why is that?
Concepción. Because I don't need to know. It's sort of like if there's a man who's like, I'm trying to become a better man by dating ugly girls, I don't need to know that I'm part of that journey.
Yeah.
Being like, I'm trying to love undocumented people, so I'm reading your book.
Yeah.
Don't fucking tell me. Just.
I think it's interesting that it's a question that,
I'm good, gone.
Go ahead, Layla.
No, I was going to say, I think it's interesting that that it's a question that, that has come up a lot. And I would say the last couple of years, it didn't used to come up even 10 years ago or, 5 years ago, people didn't ask. And there's this sort of new and almost bizarre onus on books to teach people how to be empathetic. And it's like, I know people who read a lot and are not are complete assholes, and I know people who don't read and are extremely empathetic. So it's just this new that's why I use the word onus. It's like books are there to let you engage with the story, to live in the world of the story. And it can do many things. And if it makes you empathetic, great, good for you. But it's not something that that pressure in our lives without putting it on writers to make you more empathetic. Go to your mom and dad and teach you, have them teach you that. But I find it really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, especially over the last few years with like the anti-racist book lists that are supposed to magically make people not racist.
If only, right?
Yeah. So Damien asks, Karla, you mentioned the compromise over the title of your collection. I'm curious whether either of you experienced pressures at any stage of publication to fit into a notion of American immigrant literature.
I just decided whether I wanted to extort Chris Jackson. I decided against it. No, Chris Jackson never pressured me to fit into anything.
Yeah. That's good.
No, he really didn't. Yeah. He specifically didn't. I am very fortunate to work with him because it is very rare that to find. Okay, I want to take this opportunity to thank him. It is very rare to find someone who has given me the kind of creative freedom that he has, which is not just to write about immigration the way that I have, but to also, as an immigrant writer, write about whatever I want. Because my next books with him are not about immigration. And I wanted to write about things that aren't about immigrants. And he said, you can. And I don't think I would have had that freedom with another imprint or another editor. I think they would have wanted me to keep hitting home runs with the same topic. And he believes in me as a writer, and I'm an immigrant writer, but he believes in my skills and my point of view and my voice. And that's what made the book work, that it was a story that worked because of my voice. And it wasn't because of my story. The story worked because of my voice. And he knew that. And that's why it worked. And so because he knew that, he wasn't going to pressure me to fit any idea of like a paper doll that he had imagined me to be. But I think if someone doesn't value your voice to tell a story, then they're going to think of you as, to fit in some kind of model. So it's like the way they view the work is going to be influenced by the way they view you. Yeah.
Layla, what about for you?
I'm nodding because I agree completely with what Karla said. I think that particularly I've had so many situations, particularly when I was starting out, where I've had to push back because there was that pressure. So to give you just one example among many, having a book out, I knew that because I'm Muslim, and from Morocco, that the covers, the covers were going to have things like camels and veils. And so I had to preemptively say, I don't want that on my cover. My book is set in in Ager City, not in the desert, I don't want to see desert. I don't want to see camels. I don't want to see all of that. So preemptively having to say things like that, but also just with, not necessarily with books, but I've definitely seen this with shorter pieces like essays and this way in which several editors try to pressure a writer to use biography as an entry point into whatever it is that she's writing about. So it's the conflating of biography with skills. So in other words, we want you to write about this instead of you're a writer who can write about anything, which is what Karla was talking about. And I just feel one of the great things that I love about working with so my editor is Errol McDonald at Pantheon, is that I do feel that I can do whatever I want. And that is, I just feel so fortunate because I don't take it for granted because I've had other editors that weren't like that. So it just was such it really is just, I feel so fortunate in that sense. But I've definitely been in situations where that pressure existed and I've had to push back in ways on covers, on titles, on architecture. I've had to pull essays. I mean, it's definitely real. And I do think you should fight for your voice. You have to fight for your voice. Otherwise, you can get co-opted.
Yeah, and I think we both experienced, we're both so grateful to be where we are now with our editors because we've had experiences with people who have tried to get us to lose our voices to fit something else. Yeah. And it's really hard to describe how dehumanizing that is as an artist because it's just a complete erasure. And I think it's very important to fight for your voice if you do have one as an artist. It's absolutely worth fighting for and finding someone who will honor that fight.
Yeah. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one last quick question that I think is a good one to end on. So Russ asked both of you, what were the most influential books in your lives that you'd insist students read? Layla?
I laugh because every time I get asked that question, I draw blanks. I've never read a book in my life. Let's see. The books that have been, there's so many books. It's so hard to just pick, but I'll just be very quick. I'll say the work of Toni Morrison, the work of Chinua Achebe, J.M. Coetzee, Zeix Mda, Kamara Lay, that just read everything.
That's great advice. What about you, Karla?
Oh God, I don't read.
I know you were influenced by all rock and roll stars.
By who?
By rock and roll stars.
Oh, yeah. Read the works of Taylor Swift.
Oh my goodness. We are at time, guys. I want to thank Karla and thank Layla for joining us for this hour, the National Book Foundation, of course. Please buy The Undocumented Americans and The Other Americans at your local bookstores, preferably. And I think that the National Book Foundation is going to drop a link in case anybody wants to donate. It was great to talk to you both.
It was nice to talk to you both.
Yeah.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.